When most people think of the children of Henry VIII, they picture either the merciless Bloody Mary or the revered Elizabeth I. But there was another child whose short reign would expose a level of darkness that perhaps even his infamous father would have found unsettling. Edward VI, the young monarch who took the crown at just 9 years old, would evolve from a seemingly harmless boy into one of England's most repressive sovereigns, only to meet an end so grotesque that it would cast a long shadow over the Tudor legacy. This isn't merely a tale of a sickly boy fading too soon. It's a chilling reflection of how absolute power can completely distort even a child. What happened in Edward's final months might upend everything you thought you understood about the Tudors. The year was 1537, and Henry VIII finally secured what he had long desired, a legitimate male successor. Edward's birth was hailed as a national triumph, bringing hope after years of uncertainty over the royal line. But joy quickly turned to mourning. His mother, Jane Seymour, died less than 2 weeks after childbirth, leaving Edward without a maternal figure and making him all the more precious to his increasingly suspicious father. From infancy, Edward was treated not as a boy, but as the embodiment of England's future, constantly surrounded by protectors, scholars, and officials who never let him forget his divine purpose. This artificial environment, devoid of typical childhood experience, laid the groundwork for something far more sinister. Unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom endured their father's cruelty and neglect, Edward was raised in a bubble of admiration and unwavering approval. Perhaps out of guilt for how he had treated his daughters, Henry VIII lavished Edward with attention that bordered on deification. The prince received an elite education, but his instructors were far from neutral. They were zealous Protestant reformers, carefully selected to shape Edward into a militant defender of their cause. By age 6, Edward was immersed not only in classical languages, but also in rigorous theological doctrine. His lessons were less about knowledge and more about instilling a rigid worldview that glorified Protestantism and demonized Catholicism. His chief tutor, John Checkey, though highly intelligent, was a fervent ideologue who taught Edward to see England as a divine project, destined to be cleansed of all Catholic taint, whether it was history, politics, or ethics. Every topic Edward studied was interpreted through the twin lenses of religious purity and absolute monarchy. By the time he was 8, he could articulate sophisticated theological justifications for the execution of Catholics, and believed that opposing him would be equivalent to defying God. What made Edward's early formation especially perilous was the merging of advanced intellectual training with a complete absence of emotional development. He could argue doctrine with learned men, yet had never experienced genuine friendship, empathy, or ordinary childhood interaction. His entire world consisted of adults who treated him with solemn deference, shaping a boy who could grasp sophisticated political ideology, yet lacked any real understanding of compassion or the sanctity of human life. This dangerous blend of intellectual brilliance and emotional detachment would come to define his entire rule. By the fall of 1547, England had fallen under the rule of a 9-year-old childone raised to believe he was divinely appointed to reshape the realm. Upon the death of Henry VIII, Edward VI's throne, inheriting not merely a monarchy, but a fractured nation, riven by religious strife. The young king had been deliberately shaped by the most uncompromising Protestant scholars available, men who saturated his mind with imagery of spiritual cleansing and total dominion. In contrast to his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom endured their father's brutal temperament, Edward had known nothing but flattery and exaltation. From infancy, he had been told he was destined to bring divine order. That union of absolute authority and childish volatility would soon claim countless lives. The kingdom Edward now ruled was teetering under the weight of sectarian discord. Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church had birthed the Church of England, but the population remained deeply fragmented, caught between lingering Catholic loyalty, moderate reformers, and extremist zealots. At first, Edward's Regency Council, headed by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, appeared to chart a middle path. Yet the boy king had very different visions for England's future. Almost immediately after taking power, Edward began to exhibit a troubling mix of youthful stubbornness and icy logic, frequently cutting off seasoned counselors to correct them on Protestant theology. Observers of the time were alarmed at how swiftly the child monarch assumed control. Within a few weeks of his coronation, he was already overseeing capital punishment decisions, displaying an unsettling eagerness in authorizing the deaths of those labeled as heretics. Documents from this period depict a boy who treated executions as theoretical puzzles, analyzing scriptural justifications for various penalties with the same passion he applied to academic subjects. Eyewitnesses describe Edward smiling as he signed warrants, seemingly pleased with his ability to root each judgment in biblical rationale. Early in his reign, the palace became familiar with what attendants privately called his doctrinal outbursts, violent emotional episodes triggered whenever moderate views on religion were proposed. Edward had so deeply internalized his tutor's teachings that he regarded any concession to Catholic tradition as outright treason against Christ. On one occasion, when a counselor advised leniency for Catholic nobles practicing their faith in private, Edward is said to have hurled his inkpot at him, screaming that divine punishment would befall the kingdom for such cowardice. Though initially dismissed as immature outbursts, these incidents revealed something more alarming: the emergence of a genuine religious extremist in the making. Most unnerving was the boy's apparent indifference to typical childhood joys. While others his age played with wooden swords or marbles, Edward reportedly spent hours studying the Spanish Inquisition and writing analytical notes on methods of extracting confessions. Servants even found sketches in his room portraying instruments of torture. Edward annotated these gruesome illustrations with remarks evaluating their effectiveness in forcing heretics to confess. While other boys his age were learning to ride or play sport, Edward was fixated on the most efficient ways to break human minds and bodies in the name of Protestant purity. What made Edward especially perilous was his fusion of zealous religious conviction and sovereign power. While his advisors maneuvered behind the scenes, the young king embraced every doctrine about divine monarchy with disturbing fervor. He meticulously documented his reign in journals that reveal a child enthralled by accounts of executions, religious oppression, and the torment of those he labeled enemies of faith. By the time he was 10, Edward was drafting sermons that were preached throughout the realm, fiery declarations demanding the total eradication of Catholic practices and warning of heavenly wrath for anyone showing mercy to heretics. But Edward's cruelty extended far beyond spiritual matters. He exhibited a mean-spiritedness that even the battle-hardened veterans of his father's reign found unsettling. When those around him made mistakes, Edward would orchestrate punishments, not to correct, but to degrade. In one case, a young page who accidentally spilled wine on royal papers was made to stand in the courtyard for hours while nobles hurled spoiled food at Himmel by Edward's explicit order. The boy king reportedly observed the spectacle with glee, jotting down notes about the victims' reactions as if he were studying animal behavior. Journal entries from this period reveal a chilling detachment from human emotion. Edward described suffering with the same dispassion he used to record weather patterns, documenting anguish and fear, as if they were mere data points. When a kitchen maid died after being lashed under suspicion of saying Catholic prayers, Edward's only comment was that the punishment had, more efficiently than expected, removed the subject from further error. Perhaps the clearest evidence of his deepening sociopathy was how he treated his own family. Although he had grown up beside Mary and Elizabeth, Edward, once king, showed no natural affection for either. Instead, he viewed them through a doctrinal filter. Mary, as a staunch Catholic, was a threat who needed to be neutralized. Elizabeth, whose Protestant leanings made her more palatable, was merely a potential asset. To Edward, kinship was just another political variable. This cold pragmatism was glaringly obvious when his uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to win his favor through flattery and generosity. Edward, rather than responding with gratitude, interpreted these actions as cynical manipulation. When Seymour was arrested for treason, Edward backed the execution enthusiastically and reportedly watched from a window as his uncle was led to the scaffold. Onlookers noted the king's utter lack of emotion as the executioner's axe struck. Instead, he filled the pages of his journal with reflections on which execution techniques were most efficient. By the time Edward turned 12, his appetite for control grew significantly more intense. The once fragile, scholarly boy had transformed into a monarch who routinely overturned his advisors' decisions, deeming them too forgiving. His Protestant agenda grew increasingly severe, with mandatory church attendance backed by a network of informers and harsh punishments for any deviation from state-sanctioned doctrine. Edward took it upon himself to design an apparatus of religious surveillance that rivaled the infamous Spanish Inquisition. Citizens were urged to report on their neighbors, and children were incentivized to expose their parents' perceived religious failings. Edward's compulsion to dominate extended to every corner of spiritual life in England. He issued intricate decrees regulating both communal worship and private belief, prescribing how subjects should pray, what theological positions they must hold, and even how they were to conceptualize God. Any divergence from these commands was treated as a betrayal of both monarch and deity, punishable by public disgrace, incarceration, or execution. Remarkably, the boy king reviewed each case himself, often amplifying the penalties when he believed leniency betrayed a lack of Protestant fervor. What emerged under his rule resembled a regime of ideological enforcer, essentially thought police where informants were rewarded and dissenters eradicated. Edward derived a disturbing satisfaction from these denunciation reports, frequently calling informants to court to extract further details about their neighbors' supposed misdeeds. Those accused of harboring Catholic beliefs endured imprisonment, torture, or execution, with the king himself escalating the severity of sentences. The royal court became a theater of paranoia and zealotry, where suspicion was currency and compassion a liability. The system of persecution Edward devised was striking not only for its reach, but for his intimate management of it. While most monarchs delegated the grim duties of enforcement, Edward insisted on reading every file, scrutinizing the allegations, and tailoring punishments to fit what he interpreted as theological infractions. His journals from this era resemble blueprints for persecution, packed with analyses of which tortures best suited different classes of heretics. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's blending of juvenile inventiveness with deadly resolve. When established punishments failed to satisfy his sense of justice, he created new, often grotesque, methods of chastisement, all defended by sophisticated theological rationale. In one case, a Catholic clergyman who refused to convert was paraded through London with a placard declaring him an enemy of Christ, while children pelted him with stones. Edward orchestrated the event from the palace, and, according to witnesses, laughed as he dictated notes to his secretary about the priest's reactions. His fanatical pursuit of religious purity extended into his own family, where it exposed his utter emotional detachment. Edward regarded his half-sister Maria, committed Catholic not as a sibling, but as the single most dangerous obstacle to his Protestant kingdom. Surviving private correspondence reveals Edward's deep-seated animosity toward Mary, hatred that was both disturbingly juvenile and profoundly unsettling. He referred to her with contempt, calling her a bastard and an enemy of Christ, while plotting legal avenues to have her stripped of her legitimacy or condemned to death as a heretic. Rather than displaying the familial loyalty expected of a brother, Edward nursed fantasies of watching his sister burned alive for her Catholic faith. His loathing for Mary transcended strategic necessity. It consumed him with a fervor that alarmed even his most fanatical allies. The young monarch spent countless hours constructing legal frameworks for removing Mary from the line of succession. He worked closely with sympathetic Protestant legal minds, eager to validate what was effectively the premeditation of sororicide. Court witnesses observed that Edward's demeanor would darken at the mere mention of Mary's name. He would retreat into seclusion, scribbling lengthy theological arguments detailing why her elimination was not just politically prudent, but spiritually essential. His plans grew increasingly meticulous and brutal. Edward drafted mock legal proceedings for Mary's arrest and execution, framing her as a traitor and a heretic. He even composed a fabricated confession in which Mary would be coerced into denouncing Catholicism and admitting her illegitimacy in exchange for a swifter, more merciful beheading rather than being burned at the stake. These chilling drafts, still preserved in the Royal Archives, paint a disturbing portrait of a mind that had abandoned political rivalry for pathological hatred. His attitude toward Elizabeth, while less overtly hostile, was no less troubling. Though he favored her Protestant inclinations, Edward viewed his younger sister not as kin, but as a strategic asset. He intended her marriage to serve as a diplomatic tool for securing Protestant alliances, dismissing her personal desires as irrelevant in the face of his religious goals. Even his apparent regard for Elizabeth was filtered entirely through the lens of utility, worth measured by how well she could serve his cause. Edward's incapacity for forming genuine personal bonds extended beyond his family. At court, he treated his nobles, advisors, and servants as mere instruments in his grand plan for a purified Protestant England. Loyalty was conditional not on service or merit, but on absolute alignment with his increasingly fanatical policies. Those who had stood by him for years could be cast aside or executed for the slightest deviation from his doctrine. In Edward's world, allegiance required total ideological surrender, personal ethics, or dissenting convictions had no place. As his health began to fail in the early months of 1553, Edward's instability only worsened. Mortality didn't humble him, it intensified his zeal. At 15, the king became fixated on guaranteeing that his religious vision would outlive him. The thought of Mary ascending to the throne and undoing his reforms ignited a desperation that would push him to the brink. The threat of having his Protestant reforms undone by his Catholic sister ignited in Edward a fury so intense it bordered on lunacy. It pushed the young monarch to entertain schemes that would have appalled even his authoritarian father. As his health deteriorated, his religious extremism did not fade, it flared brighter, as though he were racing against death to finalize a vision of a thoroughly purified England. Physicians at court observed that his sickness was accompanied by frenzied bouts of preaching. In these moments, Edward would launch into wild sermons, passionately declaring that Catholicism had to be eradicated, even if it meant wiping out every Catholic in the kingdom. At first, these outbursts were dismissed as the ravings of a fevered mind. But when he was lucid, Edward's intentions proved just as fanatical. His words weren't delirious nonsense. They were deadly serious. In secret, Edward began convening with hardline Protestant radicals, forming a covert alliance to remove Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. What emerged from these meetings was a bold and merciless platoon that aimed to either imprison or eliminate both of his sisters and install a puppet regime under the control of extremist reformers. Despite his frailty, Edward threw himself into the conspiracy with a fervor that startled even his closest allies. The plan, devised with the help of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, unveiled the full transformation of Edward from sheltered princeling to ideological zealot. The plot called not only for the silencing of his sisters, but also for the wholesale re-engineering of English society under Protestant absolutism. Their scheme outlined mass executions of Catholic aristocrats, the confiscation of church-held lands, and the formation of a permanent religious enforcement agency to regulate all aspects of public and private worship. Edward didn't just approve these measures, she authored many of them. In his final weeks, the king obsessively drafted lists of Catholic targets, delineated properties for seizure, and mapped out legislation for a theocratic regime. Though weakened, his trembling hand continued to scrawl plans that amounted to a blueprint for religious annihilation. The boy, once portrayed as a passive pawn of powerful advisors, had revealed himself to be the mastermind of a fanatic agenda that could have rivaled or even surpassed the terrors of the Spanish Inquisition. Yet Edward's illness carried a bitter irony, almost poetic in its cruelty. Modern scholars now believe he suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and likely arsenic poisoning, perhaps administered inadvertently by his own doctors in a desperate attempt to cure him. Contemporary commentators couldn't ignore the symbolic twist. The monarch, who had saturated England with sectarian hatred, was now slowly dying from toxins given by those attempting to preserve his life. As the poison gradually consumed his body, Edward began to suffer from hallucinations and bouts of delirium, which his courtiers mistook for divine revelations. The boy, who had never shown mercy to his enemies, spent his final days writhing in agony, his body racked by relentless pain as he slowly deteriorated. Rather than bringing solace, his suffering only seemed to deepen his religious zeal. Court doctors observed that instead of turning inward or reflecting, Edward's torment intensified his obsessions, though his agony only strengthened his fanaticism rather than humbling it. The nature of Edward's death was particularly appalling to those who witnessed it. Physicians noted that his body began to emit a putrid stench weeks before the end, and his skin turned a ghastly green hue, consistent with advanced poisoning. His hair and fingernails began to fall out, and he was plagued by violent seizures that left him intermittently paralyzed. Once celebrated as the most handsome of Henry VIII's offspring, Edward became a grotesque specter, his body seemingly fighting against the very toxins meant to heal him. Perhaps most unnerving was the fact that Edward retained enough awareness to comprehend his fate, spending his final moments swinging between screams of unbearable pain and impassioned diatribes about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last intelligible conversations contained no mention of peace, remorse, or affection. Instead, he lamented that he would not live to finish his campaign to purify England. The dying monarch pleaded with his allies to continue the mission in his absence, assuring them that divine favor awaited those who helped usher in his religious utopia. His deathbed scene was a grim distortion of traditional farewells. Rather than expressing love or seeking redemption, Edward used his final breaths to denounce his Catholic sister and implore God to protect Protestant England from Mary's evil. Eyewitnesses claimed his final utterances were saturated with Malician, apt conclusion to a life ruled by doctrinal zeal and authoritarian ambition. When Edward passed away on the 6th of July, 1553, a wave of quiet relief swept through his court. Though few dared voice it, many saw his death as a release from a monarch whose extremist vision had begun to steer the country toward violent upheaval. Even his most loyal allies privately admitted that Edward's demise might have spared the realm from a descent into religious tyranny, though such thoughts remained carefully unspoken. The immediate fallout of Edward's death laid bare just how dependent his plans were on his own force of will. Without him to drive the scheme forward, the conspiracy unraveled rapidly. Moderate Protestants, previously complicit, now distanced themselves from what they recognized as a radical and dangerous agenda. Lady Jane Grey, once positioned to inherit Edward's vision, quickly found herself abandoned. The same nobles who had once pledged allegiance to the Protestant succession now quietly withdrew, leaving her isolated. As political reality set in, Mary's successful ascension to the throne was backed not only by Catholics, but also by moderate Protestants who had been alarmed by the extremism that characterized Edward's rule. The boy king, who once envisioned himself as England's foremost Protestant reformer, had ironically ensured that his legacy would be remembered more for its brutality and for the collective sense of relief that swept the nation upon his death. Even devout Protestants found themselves embracing the Catholic Mary as a less dangerous option compared to the radical Protestant leadership that had flourished under Edward. The irony of Edward's reign goes well beyond his failed succession scheme. The monarch who had sought to obliterate Catholicism from England had, through his uncompromising fanaticism, inadvertently revived it. His persecution of moderate Protestant voices had allowed zealots to dominate the religious landscape, alienating common believers rather than uniting them. By the time Edward died, a growing number of English Protestants were beginning to view Catholicism not as a threat, but as a haven from the harsh dogma of Edward's Reformed Church. In recent decades, historians have reassessed the reign of Edward VI, and the image that now emerges is far darker than that of a frail boy manipulated by power-hungry men. Official records and private letters reveal a youth who was not only eager to carry out religious persecution, but who also appeared to take pleasure in the pain of others. Edward's direct participation in organizing executions, along with his journals describing torture techniques in cold, analytical detail, paints the portrait of a child monarch whose power went unchecked and whose temperament verged on the sociopathic. Edward's descent from innocent prince to ruthless despot underscores the terrifying potential of absolute power. Unlike grown monarchs, who may temper their actions with political foresight or emotional nuance, Edward's complete detachment from normal relationships and his unwavering belief in his divine authority formed a dangerous mix. The child who had never been denied anything and who believed opposition to his will was tantamount to heresy became capable of horrors that even the brutal Tudor world found alarming. First-hand reports suggest that many in Edward's court became increasingly unsettled by his behavior, yet felt powerless to intervene. The very ideology that upheld his kingship, the divine right of monarchs, also forbade questioning him, effectively silencing even his most trusted advisors. Edward had built a regime in which every whim of his became enforced reality. His growing appetite for cruelty met no resistance only. Death could bring it to an end. Perhaps the most terrifying thought is what might have transpired had Edward lived into adulthood. His long-term vision for England included the formation of a permanent religious police force, the total eradication of the Catholic aristocracy, and the establishment of a surveillance state that would have intruded into even the most private realms of his subjects' lives. The adolescent who passed away in 1553 had already begun implementing elements of his oppressive agenda, and there's every indication that a fully grown Edward VI would have established one of the most repressive regimes in history. His legacy stands as a sobering testament to how tyranny can spring from the most unexpected origins and how noble intentions, when paired with unchecked authority and religious zealotry, can morph into something monstrous. The child king who believed he was rescuing England's soul came dangerously close to annihilating its body. In many ways, his untimely death may have been the greatest gift his reign ever offered his people. His life story remains a powerful warning about the perils of mixing absolute power with dogmatic conviction, particularly when wielded by someone too immature to grasp the gravity of their decisions. Edward's narrative also highlights the volatile intersection of youth, authority, and ideological extremism. While adult despots may sometimes be restrained by diplomacy or emotional ties, Edward's complete seclusion and unwavering belief in his own divine mission enabled him to envision horrors that even seasoned rulers might hesitate to consider. Instead of enjoying the innocence of childhood, he was orchestrating mass executions and sweeping religious cleansings, treating human lives as mere obstacles in his holy crusade. His rule further reveals the dangers of education when it becomes an instrument of ideological indoctrination rather than balanced intellectual development. Edward's mentors shaped a prodigious theologian, but in doing so, they also nurtured a moral void. He learned how to rationalize brutality with academic sophistication, yet never grasped the fundamentals of compassion. His tragic arc illustrates how any system that favors ideological rigidity over basic humanity can create monsters instead of leaders. Ultimately, Edward VI's short-lived rule stands as one of the most disturbing examples of innocence warped by supremacy. The prince who once embodied Henry VIII's hopes for the future morphed into a terrifying figure whose demise brought relief instead of grief. His evolution from beloved child to potential tyrant forces us to confront unsettling truths about human nature and the particular threat posed by those who believe their cruelty is divinely sanctioned. Edward's death marked more than the close of a life. It signaled the end of a dark path England narrowly avoided. The boy king's final, tortured, moments racked with physical agony, and poisoned by his hatred for his own kin provided a grimly poetic close to a reign that had once promised renewal, but delivered only dread. By dying young, Edward VI may have accidentally rendered his greatest service to the realm he so fervently sought to reshape, sparing it from the full horror of his ideological vision.